So thank you so much for coming together tonight to join Orca Books Co-op and celebrate Katerina Canyon's book of poetry, Surviving Home. You're in for a wonderful reading and discussion tonight. The event is being recorded and streamed live on Zoom, so please keep that in mind. Thank you so much to the Lamplighters for graciously hosting us tonight, and thank you to Lamplighters for offering their space and time. Thank you to our camera person, Miranda, and of course, thank you, Katerina, for sharing her poetry. Katerina Canyon is an award-winning poet, best-selling author, civil rights activist, and essayist. She is a writer who has overcome some serious obstacles and trauma. Her book, Surviving Home, which was released on November 9th, 2021, is a collection of poems that serve as a memoir of the trauma she experienced and overcame. Concisely as arresting and challenging the beliefs of family and the fantasies of tradition, the poems in Surviving Home show that home is a place you can endure rather than a place where you are nurtured. With unyielding cadence and unparalleled soundness and warmth, Katerina Canyon contemplates the prejudice and limitations buried in a person's African-American heritage, parents that seem to care for you with one hand and slap you with the other, the secret desires to be released from the daily burdens of life, as well as the surprising ways a child chooses to amuse herself. Finding resilience in the unexpected, this collection tears down the delicate facades of family. Please give a warm welcome to Katerina Canyon.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Lamplighters and Orca Books for having me. But my first poem is Involuntary Endurance. My story is not one revealed with chapter and verse. It is expressed in blood and bone. It is fingernails thrust into back muscles. It is razor blades pressed against flesh. It is told by how the shark swims through the ocean below a school of tuna, and it is not the shark's story. It is the school of tuna searching along the vast, dark, but sunlight speckled ocean, while knowing they have everywhere and nowhere in the world to flee. It is the brown bear pulling honey from the honeycomb in order to teach the cubs to survive on her own. It is not the mother bear's story. It belongs to the cubs who wandered the forest without her after she sacrificed her life to a boar grizzly to protect them. It is told through hot cylinders of pain that sear experience into the skin. It is told in front of the sharp bayonet that sprays blood-red existence against the multicolored palette of the universe. It may sit silent and still on these black and white pages, but it exists in every tremble of my leathered hand, and it is smeared into every tear-stained scream that flows through my quavering pen. This next one is called I Felt My Brother's Wrists. Bound around a foam pole by handcuffs in the dark desert night, I heard his screams and the whips crack like thunder following lightning. He was 13, I think. I was 15, maybe. The time sits in a cloud without minutes. I just remember twitching as if each crack were against my back. But they were not. I am just a witness. I hover through storms and report the heat index of memories. That night, the sky was crimson. The moon shined like a spotlight against atrocities. The whip stopped when the screams stopped. Then my father left him standing and bound to the pole for the rest of the night. Thoracic biology. For the most part, I want to learn to let go, to hurt a little less. My hurt is what hurts the most. Where did I learn to breathe through the pain, to cut off the sword piercing through my left lung? I think it was the woman who taught me to read, who taught me to understand language, or maybe it was the man who pressed the hot scalpel of any window against my skin. The chambers of the heart are maidenheads. Getting through is what I consider making love. Not that I've had many lovers, more through my head than my heart. Last night I dreamed of sex in a bed made of quicksand, where I furrowed and sank in undulating beats. I loved the way I was surrounded by obsidian, the heat, the magma that ran through my aortic arch, the holding on, the seizing, the pain. Most times when I sleep, I dream of my hands clutched tight around something I cannot see and I cannot let go. This one is called My Pain is Sculpted into Art for You to Consume. Here is my pain. Gunshots echoing into the night, bullets whizzing past me as I flee across abandoned lots, heroin hidden behind the peak bow and my panties consume it. Here is my pain. Switch marked weapons, the smell of PCP, a Black man dead in a Texas creek, consume it. This is my pain. My mother beaten black by my father beaten blue by police, over my voice, consume it. This is my pain. My furniture pushed past the sidewalk while LA marshals watched and my friends stared, consume it. This is my pain. Getting stopped by police for mumbling reasons, getting searched without cause, being followed in fear, consume it. This is my pain. Watching my Black mother die while watching white women live with the same thing, seeing my tiny baby thrive, seeing my tiny baby thrive among fat white babies, consume it. This is my pain. Watching Black babies die, consume it. This is my pain. Watching Black boys die, consume it. This is my pain. Watching Black men die, consume it. Discuss it. Write it. Allow it to give you verbal diarrhea on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. Give it a Black Lives Matter hashtag, and then do absolutely nothing. This next one is called Skill. Her stained hands wear beet juice like blood as her dark fingers glide the thin silver steel blade around one cardinal globe after another. It is difficult to distinguish the difference between skin and flesh, but she does it adeptly. I ask, how can you do this so easily? She responds, I just do. Husks break free and blotch the butcher block crimson. I ask, doesn't it scare you to use something so big? No, she responds. Her large butcher knife hovers and dances over the submissive orb as it turns. I ask, what's a period? She nicks her finger, winces, drops the beat, and grabs a towel. I tell her, you should use a peeler. She says, it's a sorry tool that blames its master. I reply, I think you got that backwards. She slams the knife on the board, and with a quick flash of turning tide, she looks me in the eye and says, girl, you know what I mean. I look down quickly, pick up a beet peel, and dye my fingertips red. This next one is called An Afterthought of a Netflix Show. When my mother was in college, one of her professors said she looked like a Black Carol Burnett. It has been 31 years since my mother's death, and I still search Carol Burnett shows for traces of her within Carol's face. Eyes gray, not brown, hair red, not brunette. I merely see mist. My mother lived with a man who abused her every day. She said, there was nowhere to go. She died before I hit 20. When I grew up, I lived with a man who abused me every day. Carol said, only I could change my life. No one can do it for me. So I left with bruises on my neck and a baby at my waist. At least Carol endures with me. She is 5 years older than my mom, if my mom had lived. I am 1 year older than my mother ever lived. It feels wrong passing my mother. It is as if I have been caught at 6 years old, wearing her favorite dress, shoes, and perfume. Carol looks pretty good for her age. Her hair is still red. It has probably dyed. When my mother died, she was mostly gray. I am not, but I have less hair than she did. Right now, you can watch Carol Burnett on Netflix. I don't think she will get another season. It seems like Stay Woke doesn't carry the same cachet as So Long. In the end, I prefer to watch reruns. They sit on my mind like happy memories, of which I have so few. Most of my flashes of the past are visions of beasts. I wish I could spend the day watching Carol talk to children, but alas, I have grown-up things to do. Authority questions. Would it have been different if I were white and if I had blue eyes and I lived on a ranch with 500 head of cattle? Would the doctor still have called me a liar, which he did? Would he have made the nurses hold me down while he pushed the speculum inside of me? Would he have said, there are no black virgins living in the Midway, before he found my hymen, which he did, before he called my mother, which he did, before he was proven wrong, which he was? Would I have told my mother if my father hadn't already taught me how to be a good girl, how to be quiet, how to use the workarounds to hold on to virginity? Would I still have something to give? In a sense, love, trust, if it had not been taken from me already. Aunt May. She cries at the stereo as if it could take her to heaven on the notes of ZZ Hill's Down Home Blues every other record or two. Uncle Eljo, that no good son of a bitch, held her heart in a vice. Then he died, relegating him to the beloved angel he never was, fleeing into mangled clouds on shredded wings made of brambles, as if Texas soil were fertile. Hill's throat pulls notes, his voice trickling crude into Aunt May's Los Angeles living room. ZZ Hill is redemption coated in Texas blood. L and ZZ are one. Their crooning calls to her before the song ends, and she restarts. Their voices harmonize mercurial, chaotic as oil gushers, spilling into the fields of Canaan. In the promised land, there are no Negro spirituals, no blues, no white man's hand smiting the black man's face, but there is always a burden for the black woman. She knows this song well, and she plays it again. Down home blues, down home blues, every other record or two. Sojourner, which is a poem I wrote in honor of Sojourner Truth. Truth is where I found you, in the cusp high over ultraviolet waves, between your time as a slave and mind fighting off the results of bondage. You were a woman who accepted no excuses for lack of rights for our mothers and daughters, demanded more for those who followed. I am a woman who accepts that most white men are fixed on one idea as to how the world should be, and it is on me to change their minds through words or actions, but never through guns or swords. White bonnet wrapped on my head as I push away racial insults and profanity. You never forgot to say who a woman could be, what a Black woman could do when we eschewed weakness and misogyny. No one helped you. You just carved a trail. No one helps me either. That's what I learned it means to be a Black woman, to be strong, to plow, to plant, to raise barns. That's what I did. That's what you did. I do that metaphorically. Now, I raised children, plowed through journals with my pen. I always remember to pin my tongue for fear of others' thoughts. This is the way you walked. I try to get my half measure full, but I think it is a little less difficult for me than it was for you. Thank you for the quarter you earned. It took us a long way, but today the world is still turned upside down, and we are working hand by hand to flip it right side up. My guardian angel. When I take this pill, you must go. Sanity leaves no room for you. Remember the smell of biscuits, scrambled eggs and sugar, syrup made by my mother every morning after her beatings. Look through the fog and cigarette smoke at the fat, bloated corpse. He must be fed, no matter how hungry you are. Never talk back. He's stronger than you. Angel, you abandoned me, just as Lot escaped Gomorrah. When I am sane, you must deal with his ghost alone. When you reach hell, there will be millions of men who beat their wives and rape their daughters. You will recognize him by the old school shag afro, big belly, gold chain, and the don't mess with Texas belt buckle. You and I will not play hopscotch or make daisy chains, for you tossed my childhood into the fire. Now I toss you. Do not cry. He hates that. I put this pill between my lips and swallow. Phoenix. My spirit animal is the phoenix. She sits as a chick on the windowsill of my hospital room and grows impatient. Having burned to ash 3 days ago, she toddles along the cement against the dark, cloudy Seattle skyline, pecks at dead bugs, and waits for the sunrise. Her feathers, black tufts of mists, sway with the wind. When she can, she will leap from the sill and fly, and will likely burn to ash again. She cannot stop herself from flying straight towards the sun. I stopped praying when I learned you abandoned me. I shake my edges for the pretense of my prayers to you, for the cloud of hope alters in a blustery air, or it disappears in the midst of the billowing skirt of sunset. I pray at the time that breath prays for a tune in contempt of meter after hearing the cry of 100 runaway angels. Up to the age I see feathers dwindle from your melting pedestal. Centuries back, I sounded like a new cherub blown from my base, one solitary step to block the cold. A lone comic sound fumed while I pressed my knees in plaster made from thistle and clover, along with your bare face which crushed against my sincerity. I pray to your stopped ear as a mute to the deaf, to the vanishing fog as it evaporates around me. Tell me, what prayers have you heard? What bright pot of gold can be credited to your virtues? Against the morning moon lay the rebuttal to my prayer, and lean over to face my eyes turned inside out of the prophet. See the consequence of silence. Blind yourself with lack of right defense as an abuser who blames his wife. Yet another attempt at self-immolation. Have you decided to move backward or forward today? You ask without encouraging consonants. A young, disinterested mouse appears approximately 2 seconds later and dawdles along the New York Times, resting at my feet. We make eye contact, and it continues along the dark wood floor and climbs to the kitchen island and climbs up the side like an ebony spider. You did not notice the direction of my eyes or the cake wrapper on the counter crinkle as the mouse nibbles through. What is it with you, you ask? Why can't you just be happy? Why can't you just suck it up? The least attentive people find happiness. Like the first potato chip, which was made by mistake. Can you imagine what it felt like to taste the first potato chip? Every time I open a bag of Lay's or Pringles, I think, you're a mistake. Truly a denizen on my thighs. The abyss is not one with the conscience. It always avoids corruption. None of these separate the trivialities from the cake. What are you doing? You ask as I pick up the knife. Slicing the cake, I respond. No more poems about my father. It is the first day of the decade. I walk my dog in the quiet, syrupy Seattle air. The great wheel flickers like a strobe light against the morning night. It is as if the city cannot stand the silence of anticipation. Resolutions are waiting on the cusp of stale champagne bubbles. Vows will be made, fulfilled, or disappointed in rainy dreams while the population sleeps off the night before. It was a bitter year's close, along with wind, rain, and a lack of fireworks. I spent the night without you. While you have always been faithful, I wonder how long before you are not. Because no matter the century, I cannot help but believe that all men must be like my father, who have every woman's mind, which includes mine, pressed under his big toe. Unfortunately, it is 17 lines into a new year, and as I am sure Nostradamus would have predicted if he had known the laughable irony of my existence, I just broke my first resolution. This will be my last poem. It is called Censorship. My poems die at the root, at stem and bloom. I could carry them to mass on tops of wreaths and sing funeral lullabies. My memories circle as melodies around the same place, a face that does not escape because it hides in my eyes. I bite it between my lips and I breathe it within my lungs. I am its mirror, its reincarnation, the lines, the rhymes, make another circle, back to the cloak, back to the demon that encapsulates nightmares. It is my face, long dead. It resurrects itself in my belly again and again. It turns around. I wish I could call it ugly, but beauty resides with those who hold it within their hands. My fingers were chopped off at birth. I cannot touch the petal or the thorn. My eyes were plucked free by roosters with long red combs and plumes, but they still call me beautiful as they mount the hills of my blindsided haunch. This affectation is for the lost words, the runaway letters, the gagged voice. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. In the titular poem, Surviving Poem, there is a couplet, the mermaid is a woman, needed music and desperation. And the couplet is somewhat of an origin story for the mermaid, and Surviving Poem, the collection, would also be an origin story. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the idea of the origin story and why it's important to tell them.
Well, it is the beginning. It is the beginning, for me, it's the beginning of survival. I felt like before that, there was really nothing but existence or this struggle under my father, under addiction, my parents' addiction. But this mermaid metaphor brought me to life. And that's where it all begins, with just realizing that I survived it. And I think that is the key with all origin stories, where there's a struggle and there's always, in tragic characters, they come from struggle. Usually a lot of them either lose parents, and while in general origin stories, parents are lost to a murder or a criminal or some sort of element that way. I lost my parents to systemic racism, and that was my origin story.
Thank you. Can you speak to the poetry as a writer? You mentioned the mermaid as the and the writing that as surviving, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about your work with that.
Well, I wrote Surviving Home when I was in the hospital during a severe bout of depression, and I just didn't know how to get out of it. And the doctor told me, to write, and that's what I did. And that's the mermaid, the music, the light, the air. That's where that comes from. I didn't even realize it at the time. It wasn't writing this collection, writing these poems. It wasn't something of tremendous deep thought. It was just the emotions and the images that I had coming out of me. And when I finished writing and I had the stack of poems, I went back and I said, this is all a cohesive piece of my life. And that's where the mermaid comes from. The mermaid is essentially me surviving. This mermaid is all of these parts of me that hold it together to rise above the storm of suffering.
Thank you. Within each poem in your collection, there's a really powerful narrative that carries the reader to the end and does create a larger portrait that is a collection surviving poem. And I was wondering how you think of narrative within poetry, or are you more attuned to that image and emotion that you were speaking about?
A lot of my poetry does carry a narrative, and I am brought to it by emotion. That's the only way I can tell the narrative, is through poetry, because that's how it started off as a child when I first started writing in my little journal. And my father saw my writing and got upset, so I switched it to stories that were about bears and little animals and creatures, and that eventually turned into poetry. And that's just how I write. But there's always a narrative, no matter how hard I try for it to not have one. If I try to make a silly poem, it never happens. There's always a story to it.
You mentioned that you started writing poetry as a child, and then it upset your father, so you switched it to more like a fiction story, maybe, and then it ended up going back to poetry. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Well, I've always had poetry is some of the first things I remember in my childhood. Of course, I remember things like Dick and Jane books and Cinderella, but beyond that, they're the books that I remember just kind of clutching to me were things like Little Bear, poems and rhymes through Childcraft, collection of Edgar Allan Poe stories and poems. And, these are things I carried around as a 5-year-old. So poetry was always something that was just in me, that it was a part of my DNA. And when I was in high school, I fell in love with Shakespeare and Blake, because they didn't really, during my time, offer much in the way of African American poets in high school. But as I got older, I started to appreciate poets like Audre Lorde, and I always had to have poetry with me. I remember there was a time when, after my husband and I had been married for a while, and we were watching TV, and someone was reciting a poem, and I recited it with him. And he said, "Wow, you really love poetry, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah, who have you been married to?" And he said, "Well, it just occurred to me, it's like every time there's something on the TV with a poem, you're nearly always there ready to recite it. So I guess now, but I don't know who I'd be without it. It's like it's my life preserver."
Thank you. You speak beautifully about poetry, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to maybe like the idea of like the emotion being conveyed into poetry, or maybe the threshold being passed in poetry. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about like the emotion and the image, and then the text as it appears, like the words themselves.
Well, the emotion is something that I've always had a hard time dealing with, just expressing emotion. And I think it's because of the volatile house I grew up in, where harsh emotions or strong emotions were followed by violence or something that was horribly unwanted. And so I always kept things bottled in. But with writing, I would have this safe place to put the emotions. And so that's why I start with the emotions come first. And then, of course, there's a story, but a lot of times when I start saying something, I don't know where it's going to go. Even when I'm talking to you now, I don't know where I'm going with this. Yeah, it starts with the emotion, and then as I'm writing down the emotions, it's usually like, I feel really bad about this. It reminds me of when this happened. And usually I have an image that comes to my head that goes with that emotion. And when I teach writing, I will say, I often start with this, my students, and I say, think of an emotion, give that emotion a color, and give that emotion an image, and then write about what that color and image remind you of. And that's how I write poetry.
Amazing, thank you. So like identifying the emotion through the color and image and then using that as a method working towards it. Thank you. There's a poem in your collection called All Day Long, and there's a few stanzas that I will read. We are free, I tell him, we are infinite because I declare it as sister and baby. And then the poem ends with the lines, or maybe it was I who had the rabbit scream, who's to remember? And it's a beautiful poem. And when I first read it, I responded to what I perceived as like the confidence and the bravery of the child in you, in reading the reality of the situation that you and your brother are in, and specifically the line like as sister and deity. And towards the end of the poem, I was reminded that both people in this poem are children, and there's almost a cruelty in asking a child to have to become a deity or asking them to be the adult because the adults around the children are unavailable. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the craft that went into that poem, and how would you honor the space that reminds the reader that these are children while simultaneously showing the bravery and emotional intelligence?
I meant to read that poem today. I don't know.
Would you like to do that?
Yeah, and then I don't know what happens to anything. All day long. In a few minutes. This thing does not. Sorry, who's ever out there.
I think it's twisted a little.
There we go.
There you go.
In a few minutes, my father will toss the screaming boy into the closet. I will be sent in behind him as a sedative, the autism whisperer in knee socks and a Snoopy t-shirt. I was always able to contain the rabbit, having once been a rabbit myself before my birth, and I recall the transition, the piercing of the coral shell, the faucet that opened and the hook that broke my character. I should have held tight to my mother's twine. My lock should have tied true. Instead, my framework is cracked. I cannot repair it with plaster or denial, and truth does not furnish it either. I hold my brother's hand. I clench my breath. The scream lowers to a bleat. The closed door becomes an ocean, our prison an oasis, just he, me, and the sea, playing hand-clap games, and we cannot be bound. We are free, I tell him. We are infinite because I declare it as sister and deity. Our situation is what it is. We are stuck. We can choose whether we are stuck in darkness or in light. You can both find both truth and lies in perception. Does he understand me? Autism makes him mute, not stupid. We are free. He laughs. We are free. I laugh. We are free as we clap our hands together and laugh and sing. And I sing of birds tweeting and razzmatazz while he claps and sways and he rocks back and forth. His bleat is a hum. Perhaps that was he, or maybe it was I who had the rapid scream. Who's to remember? Wow. So, what did you ask me?
What I was hoping you speak to the craft that went into that poem specifically, and how you honor the space that reminds the reader that these are children, while simultaneously showing us the bravery and emotional intelligence and love.
There's a lot in this poem. When I started this poem, I was thinking about how I used to have to go in the closet with my brother. My brother would get really upset and he'd be screaming and flail. My father would toss him in there, but he'd still kick and scream and flail. And I had the idea that I could go in and calm him down. It worked once, but then every time it happened, I kept getting thrown in there to do it. And after a while, I didn't like it too much, but I did it anyway. That's what you do. So that's what it started to be about. But then this section in the middle where I talk about how I was once a rabbit myself, I thought about how, who knows where autism comes from and why we're autistic. So I was thinking maybe at some point we were the same, and then just something happened where I went one way and he went the other. And like this crack of my shell had to do with like the abuse that I experienced as a child, and the sexual trauma that I experienced as a child, and that's like the cracking of the coral shell. And I often, before I got through this book, and as I was writing this, I was thinking about, like, I should have held tight to my mother's twine. And that had to do with, like, the first time I was abused, I was making cornbread with my mother, and my father grabbed me and told me it was time to go to bed. So if I had stayed in the kitchen, and it was like this self-blame that I was writing about in this poem of staying in the kitchen and not letting go, then maybe none of this would have happened. And so in honoring the childhood, again, I replaced with animals, the rabbit, Snoopy, t-shirts. I just hand clap games, which we used to do in the closet. Swings in the razzmatazz, rock to the street, all of. And he and I would play these games and they would calm him down. So that was kind of it's a narrative, but it also keeps the reader in the space of children. And that's how we do that. Yeah, when it's one thing to read them, but when you say to read them and think about them so that I can give you an answer is a completely different animal. Yeah, it feels okay. Feels vulnerable, but it's okay. It's the past, but it lives and it's black and white pages.
Thank you. Thank you for that
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk about the titles and some of the poems. So that one specifically, it's called All Day Long, and it's you move through the poem, and when you return to the title, it's the context that this is an all day long event, right? This is not an hour or a moment. It's long, and I was wondering if you could speak to how you find the titles. They come first, they come after.
They come after, definitely. It's interesting that you should ask me about my titles because there's this poet named Sharon Smith Knight who just passed away recently, and she was a dear friend. And I used to have the hardest time titling my poems. I have a bunch of them untitled. And then Sharon, I heard this poem by Sharon about 20 years ago. And she wrote this poem about, I don't understand how poets don't title their poems. And she's like, it's like having a child and not naming it. So I decided to, from that point on, after hearing this poem, that I was going to name every one of them. And it's so difficult for me. It takes me a while to come up with a title for my poem. And I sit there and I have to like read through the poem again and just think about what it's really about. And it's sort of like this visual in living in the poem to say, okay, what is this really about? Where do I want the reader to be? What sort of space are we in when we're talking about this poem?
Thank you. And where do you want the reader to be? I love that, and how the title clues the reader in on where they're supposed to be. And I'm wondering, when you write your poems, do you write for our audience? Are you thinking of the reader, or are you thinking about the text or the poem or the emotion? Is there a connection to the reader before the reading?
No. When I write the poem, or these collection of poems, I wasn't thinking about the reader at all. I was the audience for this book was me. Sometimes I will think about the reader and say, is the reader going to understand this? And sometimes that's good for, especially when I'm writing about things like this. Sometimes I don't want the reader to understand. I don't want them to understand what I had to go through. I want to just let it just sit kind of under the surface, kind of like my life has always been. And sometimes I put it right out there, but there are things that happen to me that I just kind of like sit under the surface. And sometimes when I read those poems, it just scares me inside because I'm like, do they get that? What the vulnerable places coming from? Do they understand? And that's scary.
Thank you. There's another poem in your collection called Child Bride, and it's another example of when the title of the poem is sitting very heavy, just the poem Child Bride, it's very wishful. It's like very wishful, happy ideas that a young girl may have. And that in the way that the title has kind of puts a pressure on the dissonance between the expectation and the reality, which is being in Child Bride and also the entire collection survived from home. There's the juxtaposition of child and then the heavy word bride, and then the heavy word surviving, and then the word that carries the expectation or certain connotations home. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that duality of that word of the expectation versus reality.
That was me again, coming from this childlike place of this wounded little girl who had all these dreams, these expectations of what life should be. And they're little girl expectations. They're not like full-grown woman expectations. I think like one of them is I wish for ice cream or something like that. Where, but it also goes along with this childhood, you know, pretending to be a bride and have a wedding. But then I wanted it to have like this heaviness of she's pretending, but she's actually living this too. She's living this life of a mother, of a wife, and still trying to be a child in the middle of all of it. And that's what I was trying to convey in writing that poem.
Thank you. Do you think there is a duality in childhood of kind of what we're told will happen and then what actually does happen? Sorry, it's a messy question, it's for me, but
Yeah, I do. I think that every generation deals with some level of betrayal from their parents. And I think you see that in millennials where they are sold this story of you work hard, get straight A's, you go to the right college, you graduate the right college, and you will have a successful job and the world will work out great for you. But that isn't how the world works ever. I don't know. Never worked for it that way for me anyway. But and so they say, what happened? You know, why isn't the world working this way? I went to college. All I have now is debt. And this is debt that their parents didn't have to deal with. But this generation does. And then you have the Generation Z, who were raised by Gen Xers who are angsty about life to begin with, and they raise angsty children who have no expectations at all because their parents don't. And they start off disappointed. And I think that there is a level of trauma that happens with each generation that parents oftentimes try to smooth over. But as the pandemic teaches us, there is no smoothing over what goes on.
thank you. And just a few more questions, and everything you just said was so insightful, and I'm kind of reeling from it. But I was wondering about, wondering about poetry as kind of like a reflection. So I'm thinking about it in regards to activism and also witnessing, and then, you know, artists, you know, with poetry, they then reflect back and we are allowed to read it. I'm actually thinking of one of the poems is read and then we consume the art after. And I'm wondering if you can speak to poetry maybe being a reflection of something that we aren't looking closely at, but this artist has, and they're in fact a gift for poetry, and we're looking through it. But
I think that art in any form is a microscope. And it is our job as artists to stop and slow down and look at what's going on. And it is, and if you choose for that to be your job, that is your imperative above everything else. You let everyone else run around and be busy and make money and do whatever it is they're going to do. But when you decide that you are going to be a poet or an artist, you have to stop and be that microscope. Because that's the job description. And you have to be honest about it. And it's, I don't want to say it's the hardest job in the world, because I feel like a lot of people say that about their job, but it is a very challenging thing to do, to stop, look around, and be honest about what you see. And that goes back to the poem that yet another attempt at self-immolation, where I had to stop, look around, and be honest about what I saw. And a lot of people can't do that. And the people who can live a very painful life.
well, thank you so much for this conversation. It's really been an honor, and thank you so much for sharing the poetry.
And thank you for having me. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you.